If you're familiar with jokes and stereotypes about Canadians, you'll know a lot of them revolve around our appreciation for maple syrup. That and some hogwash about us saying oot and a boot. We know how to use diphthongs, thank you very much. But if you ask Canadians what the most quintessentially Canadian food was, most would say either maple syrup or poutine. And I would argue that maple syrup is the better of those choices, because sure, poutine is good, but unlike poutine, it doesn't trace its origins back to European cooking. It actually goes back much further in the area to a lot of the Indigenous groups. But I guess a bunch of those Canadian maple syrup stereotypes are true. We do produce about 70% of the world's maple syrup. The largest heist in Canadian history was the Great Maple Syrup Heist. We do have large federal reserves of maple syrup stored up, and some would argue the industry is largely run by a cartel. But I would never say that, of course. But why is it so popular here? Well, I guess first off, it's pretty spankin' tasty. It's a really sweet taste with a unique edge that pairs well with a lot of foods. Pancakes are kind of the classic example, but there's a lot of beverages, desserts, glazes, and cooking liquids for meat and vegetables. Closest maybe to a butterscotch or toffee flavor, but with a distinct edge. Sometimes actually the spice fenugreek has been used as a substitute for maple flavoring. It's an interesting taste. It's these Manitoba maples, I would call it almost more of a slightly green taste to it, not even regardless of the buds. It's a little different from standard maple syrup, but you can notice the sweetness already just in the sap. Yeah, that's pretty good there. Got that good woody flavor. But why Canada specifically? There's a lot of other places around the world with lots of maple trees. Well, that kind of comes down to two things. First, the species of maple syrup used, and secondly, our climate here. All, or at least most, species of maple do work for making maple syrup, but the most efficient one is the sugar maple. Its sap has the highest sugar content of any maple, plus it's got a pretty good flavor. And this sugar maple grows mostly throughout southeastern Canada and the northeastern US. Now, there aren't that many of those sugar maples in my area here. I'm kind of in the fringe zone where they don't grow as well. So I'll instead be using a Manitoba maple. The sugar content in the sap is a little bit lower, so I'll have to boil it for longer. And the flavor is a little bit different, but it still works pretty well. As to why our climate is ideal for producing maple syrup, it all starts with the sap. See, throughout the summer, as the tree is doing photosynthesis with its leaves, it produces sugars, and those get, a lot of them, put into the sap. And the sap gets transferred around the tree, potentially moving the sugars into storage or potentially using it right away. When spring comes and the snow starts to retreat, that sap starts to move a lot within the tree. When it freezes at night, the sap will get sucked up into the branches to freeze there, and then when it thaws during the day, it'll thaw and start moving around to the areas of lower pressure within the tree. And if you drill a hole, that's an area of low pressure, so you'll have it leaking out of there. But that daily back and forth, that's important because it keeps the sap flowing for a long time before the buds on the tree open. Once the buds open, then the sap starts to taste kind of funny, and it doesn't make good maple syrup. Compare this to the climate in a lot of other places with maples, and either the cold times aren't cold enough or the daytime temperatures are too hot, and you have a sapping season that's a lot less consistent and a lot shorter as well. So Canada in the southeast and maybe a bit of the central regions has more the ideal springtime climate. Now, hopefully this works. It's been a bizarrely hot and non-snowy winter. It is a blisteringly hot 4 degrees outside right now, and the snow is almost gone, and it's only the start of March. So hopefully that hasn't messed with the tree's sap cycles too much this year. If you're seeing this video, chances are something probably worked out. So let's get started, shall we? First, you gotta choose your trees. Generally, you want them at least 30 to 40 years old, or once they're at least a foot in diameter. I should probably stick with metric. At least 30 centimeters in diameter. I've got 5 that should work here, all fairly hefty fellows like this one here. And the bigger they are, the more holes you can put in them. Now, the timing when you tap the tree, that daily freeze-thaw cycle, obviously varies depending where you are. Mid-February to mid-March in a lot of the sugar maples range. Normally, our Manitoban winters are a bit colder and longer, but this year, all bets are off, and it looks like now's the time. You want it to be below freezing during the nights and thawing, warm but mild during the days. If you're a bit early, that's fine. You just won't get sap yet. Now we drill. You want it about 5 to 8 centimeters deep at a slight upward angle. For width, whatever fits with your spigots. I'm using a 1/2-inch bit here. So clean out the hole, make sure you're seeing healthy, light-colored sapwood, and tap the spigot in lightly. You don't want to crack the wood by tapping it in too hard. The Indigenous had a slightly different method actually, less of a hole and more of like a V-shaped notch, and with a piece of bark or reed sticking out, and that's what would guide the sap into potentially a bark bucket, sometimes an animal stomach. So once you got that set up and the buckets are attached, you wait. It's good to check it every day so it doesn't spoil in the warmth, and you can basically collect until the buds on the tree start to open up, because then the sap will start tasting funny. Now, an interesting question with this is, how was it discovered? Because with like a lot of foods, you'll have where the answer is simply people were hungry, and in their hunger they tried eating this leaf or seed, root or fruit. With the sap of a tree, it's not quite as obvious how you would figure it out. One of the more common origin stories for maple syrup amongst some indigenous groups is of a chief who threw a tomahawk at a maple tree right above where he happened to have left a bucket. Now, putting a wound in the tree would have caused the sap to flow there, and when his daughter, or sometimes his wife, went out looking for liquid to cook some meat in the next day, they saw this bucket full of liquid from the tree, decided to cook the meat in there, and figured out, hey, this stuff's pretty spankin' tasty. It's also worth noting that sometimes squirrels will nibble off the ends of maple branches and lap up the sap that comes dripping out from there. And living as close to the land as they did, a lot of indigenous groups, it was common for them to watch animals and how they used plants and see if they could glean some information from that. So that's another possible way they learned about it. In any case, they did discover the wonders of maple syrup, or sweet water as they sometimes called it, and cane sugar hadn't been traded in this area yet, so maple sugar and maple syrup became very important flavorings, calorie sources, and just general reasons to celebrate the coming of spring. Anyway, now I have a few buckets of sap saved up. The next step is to concentrate this. It's currently at about 1 to 2% sugar, so we need to get that up to 66% for the syrup. A side note though, you can actually use just the plain sap for some things already. It'll be a lot more mild than maple syrup, of course, but if you estimate about 3 cups of sap being a little over a tablespoon of maple syrup, then if you're making a soup or a drink or something that calls for just a little bit of maple syrup and a bunch of water, may as well save yourself some work and just use it straight. So for concentrating the sap, you can get pretty fancy with this. Reverse osmosis is one of the common techniques commercially, but I'm just going to go with one of the classic techniques, boiling it down. It's very slow but very simple. The steps are pretty straightforward. Filter your sap, bring it to a boil, and keep it boiling as you keep adding more sap to the pot. Eventually, once it hits about 103.8 degrees Celsius, you'll have syrup. And this will take a while. It takes about 40 liters of sap to make 1 liter of maple syrup, and that's coming from a sugar maple tree. Remember, those have the most sugar in the sap. Other ones will take even longer than that. So will mine. This is Manitoba Maple. There's more efficient ways to do this and less efficient ways. You can use wider, flatter pans. That'll help boil it down more quickly, but then you would also need to be more attentive to make sure it doesn't burn. This has taken me about 10 hours to get to this point already. It is starting to turn a nice yellow color, but we still have a little ways to go yet. And you can cook it longer past the maple syrup stage if you want to get different products. I mean, syrup is the first stage, but if you go longer, you can get to maple taffy and maple butter, and then eventually pure maple sugar, though the cooking technique would be a bit different there, because that can be hard not to burn. Once it starts to get sticky, you're getting close to the syrup stage. You can see this is getting a bit more viscous. Definitely getting there, but still a little ways to go yet. Already quite sweet though. Now, as the sugar concentration goes up, so does the boiling point of the liquid. So you'll know it's become good maple syrup once it hits that temperature of 103.8 degrees Celsius. Any lower than that, and it'll spoil more easily. Any higher than that, and it'll start to crystallize on you. There can be some grit and debris in there, so best to filter that out. It's not harmful stuff, just mostly sugars and minerals from the sap, but it gives it kind of a gritty texture, so it's best without it. Then just put it into sterilized jars and it's ready to use. So this is the result here of about 25 liters of sap being boiled down. Comes down to about 0.7 liters in the end. And you can see that the filter that I used wasn't quite fine enough. They're a little bit less clear than they could have been, and there's a bit of that sugar sand at the bottom there, but I don't know, that's fine. If you just let it settle like I have and take from the top, that shouldn't be an issue. So let's give this a taste test. Yeah, okay, that's really good. It's interesting because in some previous year's batches, the flavor, it's not exactly the same as you would get from like a store-bought maple syrup. There's a little bit of a distinctive edge it usually has. But this one, you could easily convince me that this was store-bought, kind of a mid-amber syrup. Very sweet, of course. Got a little bit of, well, woody sounds almost like a derogatory as a flavor, but the smell of maple wood, there's a little bit of that in there, some kind of toffee notes to it, I would say. That'll go really well on a lot of things. Now, I think there's one more thing I need to do here yet. I don't think this video would be quite complete if I didn't try making one of the most popular snacks from a lot of Canada's biggest winter festivals. That's maple taffy. Yeah, let's do it. So this is a pretty simple addition onto the maple syrup recipe. You can start with store-bought stuff if you want. And I'm just going to make a little bit. All you really need to do is boil it a little bit longer and get it nice and sludgy and viscous into the 112 to 118 degree range. And that looks like the right temperature. Look at that nice sludgy viscosity there. Now just get out a fork or a popsicle stick or something like that and let's head out to find some snow. Well, that's not happening. So, fortunately, I anticipated that this might happen, that the snow outside might all melt, so I saved a bit in my freezer here. Now, it is a bit more ice crystals than snow now, but it should still work. I think this was free of animal residue. So this is a classic treat at Festival de Voyageurs and also Carnaval de Quebec, two of Canada's biggest winter festivals, but all you really do now is just pour it onto the snow and then roll it up. Oh, look at that. Now it's just, look, it's starting to thicken up. You can just kind of roll it up on the fork. And there we go. That's good too. Obviously quite similar to the taste of the maple syrup. A little more concentrated. So a little bit stronger maple flavor in there. It's got a pretty good texture, like it's you can see how stiff it is there. You can go a bit stiffer than this yet. Got a chewiness to it. I think there's still a bit of sugar sand in this stuff, so slight grittiness, but nothing bothersome about it. Kind of chewy, but it melts in your mouth, so that's nice too. You can see why this was so popular with both the Indigenous and with the early settlers. It's definitely makes the winters a little more bearable when you have this to look forward to in the spring. It's a pretty addictive flavor. I mean, it's got that strong sweetness, but man, that maple flavor just really adds to it, adds some body. So it's not just like eating pure sugar. I mean, it is, for all intents and purposes, mostly sugar there. That's diabetes on a stick, this stuff, but everything has its price, I suppose. I was intending to take 1 or 2 bites for this taste test here, but I've eaten like 2/3 of it already. That's good. But anyway, that's all I have for today. Thank you for liking and subscribing or otherwise supporting my channel. And if you have any corrections, suggestions, or good maple flavored recipes, or if you're from Vermont and upset that your syrup industry wasn't mentioned, feel free to comment down below. Man, that's good. I wasn't intending to finish all of this. And for more interesting plants from around the world, join me next time on Ambling with Sam.